What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and this is the fourth part of a series of videos I am doing on the American Open Wheel Civil War, the split. And this one, specifically the year 1996. Originally I had written this to cover 1996 to 1999, but upon further editing there was just too much to cover and the video ended up being way too long. So let's just jump right in. First of all, there is one thing you need to understand throughout the entirety of the split. I keep mentioning it because it is that important, and in particular in relation to how 1996 played out. And that is, if you go back to Dan Gurney's white paper, the formative document for kart back from 1978, the idea of a major league sport is mentioned. Essentially, the idea was that the fans would know that they are getting quality entertainment, the cars and the stars driving for the big teams and the big races, which will legitimize the whole operation and put the butts in the seats. This is where the true downfall of American open wheel racing was. So with that in mind, let's begin. In early 1996, I believe shortly after the Long Beach race, kart was stripped of the IndyCar name. For confusion's sake, in this series I would refer to the kart series as the kart series, whereas from 1992 to 1996 at the time, coincidentally the series' major boom years, especially with Mansellmania, it was called the Kart IndyCar World Series. Simply put, it was argued that kart no longer raced Indy cars because they don't race at Indy, being on the other side of the fence in the split. While this wasn't technically wrong, it created an incredibly awkward situation where cars that looked very much the same, and quite possibly actually were the same for 1996, were forced to be called two different things simply based upon which series they were racing in. You have a scenario where all Indy cars are champ cars, but not all champ cars are Indy cars. An Indy car could race outside of Indy, but a champ car couldn't necessarily race at Indy. Just think about this as a casual viewer. Indy cars were raced by the best in America in 1995, but come 1996 they were raced by nobodies all of a sudden? Where did all the drivers go? To say that this had to have been confusing to the general public and race promoters is perhaps an understatement. While the hardcore fans understood it, most of the racing series cannot survive on only the hardcore crowd. As part of the agreement struck, the Indy Racing League could not use the IndyCar name until after 2002. It was also worth pointing out that some races actually kept the word Indy in their titles, such as Surfers Paradise as well as Toronto, even though they were champ car races, because it just wasn't confusing enough. Moving on to May 1996, we have the first real showdown. With the stars being in karts and having no reason not to be in kart, it's where the money still was, it's where the teams still were, the IRL sponged up whatever drivers it could. The IRL field was basically Arie Luyendyk, Team Menard, and a few guys who would go on to become IRL heroes, and mostly random guys who people only remember for the sake of barroom trivia. The best drivers were not at the best race in May 1996. Instead, guys like the legendary hero known as Slick Racing Gardner, no really, look him up, were in the Indy 500. As previously mentioned in the previous episode, with a freshly paved track and the previous year's machinery, the 4-lap and 1-lap records fell at Indy. Except, naturally in this world, it could not be that simple unless you understood the unique qualifying procedure at Indy. And of course, most people don't. At the end of pole day, the only day which you could qualify on the pole, Scott Brayton had pole position for the Indy 500 as well as the records. Driving a Lola with a powerful Menard engine and having been one of the fastest drivers at the Speedway, pole sitter in 1995 as well, he was perhaps the driver the Indy Racing League was made for. The front row, going into that evening, would be Brayton, Luyendyk, and Tony Stewart. Yes, that Tony Stewart. And then it wasn't, because Arie's car was disqualified because it was determined to be underweight by about 7 pounds. Thus his time was disallowed, and he would have to qualify the next day instead, no longer eligible for pole position. While his run the next day, the famous 236.986 mile per hour 4-lap average, would give him the record that still remains to this day, it would only now net him 20th position. If you knew the procedure, it made perfect sense, and everyone knew the rules there at the track, of course, but when the track record holder manages to qualify 20th after qualifying slower in a car that was determined to be underweight, well, you're going to confuse some people. But a little less than a week later, it got worse. Much worse. On Friday, May 17th, a little over a week before the race, pole sitter Scott Brayton was killed in a crash. A tire lost pressure going into turn 1. He eventually ended up hitting the wall in turn 2 and was killed on contact with the wall. I must mention, though, in my opinion, it is Scott Brayton's death that forced the Speedway to lead the charge on track safety, ultimately culminating in what we now know as the safer barrier. They had safer barriers, or soft walls as they were known back then. They were a different technique, up as soon as 1998, if I remember correctly. Very early on, well ahead of the game. As for CART, the US 500 at Michigan was revving up. While CART and Michigan weren't new to one another, the situation was. Rather than being just another 500-mile race on a stupid fast 2-mile super speedway, it would be CART's entry into this pissing match. The US 500 would begin a couple hours after the Indy 500, of course to steal any thunder possible. Like I said, it was a pissing match. Otherwise, it was business as usual. As for the races themselves, well, the Indy 500 went well. Or that is to say, these guys who were in way over their head didn't do anything too silly that it's still a joke 20 years later. Buddy Lazier, one of those guys who had run in CART occasionally earlier in his career but not really gone anywhere with it, would win the 500. For those of you guys into symbolism, that race ended with a large crash exiting turn 4 on the final lap. But while that was going down, there was a race up the road in Michigan. The US 500 was getting ready to kick off. If you believe in symbolism, here is another sign that basically should have said, "We have angered the vengeful racing gods and must repent. We must correct this." In one of the most bizarre moments in high-level racing ever, to be entirely honest, the stars of CART managed to wad up half the field before even taking the green flag. Coming to the green, Jimmy Vasser and Adrian Fernandez made contact, and the calamity was on from there. We're talking about public server online racing turn 1 at Monza levels of calamity here. We're talking iRacing Week 13 bottom split rookie street stocks in real life. But because the race hadn't actually started, this was before the green flag had even waved, backup cars were brought out. Seems legit, eh? While the first start of the race was clean, the beginning portion of the race was marked by heavy attrition. Jimmy Vasser, who had destroyed his car in half the field before the green flag, the first start, would ultimately win the joke of the race. The damage had been done. The US 500 had been conceived as a power play, a shot at the jugular of the Indy 500. Had the race been spectacular, as it very well could have been, it very well could have worked. But with the race itself being unrememberable at absolute best, and mostly remembered as a total farce while the nobodies racing in Indy kept it together, well, who were the best drivers? CART believed, and frankly we all know that they were entirely correct to believe without a shadow of a doubt, they had the best drivers. But on that day, with the spotlight shining on both series the brightest that they had, they simply failed to answer the bell. I really feel that this one day is the root for the eventual failure of CART. Yes, I know there's a lot of issues with CART as an organization moving forward in the next couple years in this series, and I will talk about those. However, you can't build a house without a foundation, and in this moment where the lights are as bright as they could possibly be, all the extra focus and attention on those two races because of the split, and to have a terrible race play out that was just an embarrassment. I mean, you can't build a series that's supposed to be major league when you have just promoted yourself to the general populace as a joke. They came expecting Major League Baseball, instead they got Double-A baseball in the minor leagues. It's never going to work that way, regardless of the political climate. But that wasn't all that 1996 had to offer. During the CART race in Toronto in July, CART rookie, journeyman rookie, I should add, Jeff Krosnoff and trackside marshal Gary Arvin were killed. Stefan Johansson went for a pass while Krosnoff was in the process of already passing him, at which point Krosnoff went airborne into the fence. The car was destroyed. Arvin was killed in the process. Remember, we're talking about the 90s here. By the time we get into the 90s, a driver dying was no longer something that was considered quote-unquote acceptable, and we'll just move on like it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where they were just drivers dying all over the world in different forms of racing, left and right, and that was just part of the territory. That was no longer the case by the time it gets to the 90s, and every time it happens, it was a negative thing, of course. But there was a special ray of sunshine at the end of the year. 1996 kart champion would be an American, once again, Jimmy Vasser, the guy who wadded up half the field at Michigan. But even that couldn't just be what it was in this environment. As you may remember, one of the key motivators behind the IRL was creating a quote-unquote all-American series predominantly for American drivers and teams, because they just didn't get the rides that they should, in their opinion, in the kart series. But can you really say that when an American wins one of the most competitive series in the world? Or was he just not American enough? A problem that we still see developing to this day. Just because he didn't race wingless sprints on dirt in Indiana, he's not American, I guess? It makes the whole thing look as preposterous as it truly was. So that was more or less 1996. Or in other words, it was a year. Hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.